For over 100 years, a small glass jar sat inside a French museum, treated like sacred treasure. Inside it, a blackened human rib, a fragment of bone, a scrap of burned cloth, all coated in something dark nobody had ever properly tested. Millions of people believed it held the actual remains of a 19-year-old girl burned alive for heresy in 1431. Catholic pilgrims traveled across the country just to stand in front of the glass. Some knelt, some prayed, some simply stood there in silence, because they believed they were finally close to her, after 436 years of thinking nothing of her body had survived at all. The Archbishop of Tours personally kept it under his authority. It wasn't locked away in a storeroom or filed in some forgotten archive. It was displayed, protected, and vouched for by the church itself. Engravings of the jar were printed in books about her life, presented as proof that at least one fragment of her had survived the fire. Photographs of it circulated in pamphlets sold to visitors, the same way postcards of famous landmarks get sold today. School children were taught its story as settled fact, one more detail in the life of a national heroine, right alongside the siege of Orléans and the coronation at Reims. Even historians who should have known better treated its authenticity as a given, because by the time anyone thought to question it, it had already survived a century of unbroken religious and academic tradition. Tradition has a way of doing that. The longer something goes unchallenged, the more challenging it becomes to challenge it at all. Every year that passed without anyone raising a serious objection functioned as another layer of proof, even though nothing about the object itself had actually been verified. For nearly a century and a half, almost nobody questioned it. Then a team of forensic scientists finally got permission to open the jar and test what was actually inside. What they found didn't just embarrass a museum, it rewrote one of the most famous execution stories in history, and it exposed a fraud that had fooled bishops, historians, and millions of ordinary believers for generations. This is the forensic case that exposed who really faked the remains of Joan of Arc, and why it took nearly 600 years for anyone to catch it. If you're into real forensic mysteries like this one, hit subscribe. I cover cases like this every week. Now, here's how a fake relic like this survives undetected for almost 6 centuries. Joan of Arc's story starts long before the jar, long before the trial, in a version of France that no longer exists. It was a country cut in half by war, occupied in the north, loyal to a disputed king in the south, exhausted after nearly a century of fighting the English. She was born a peasant girl in the village of Domremy, in a household that had nothing to do with politics or the military, and as a teenager she claimed to be visited by the voices of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Saint Margaret of Antioch, telling her to help drive the English out of France and see the crown prince properly crowned king. It's worth pausing on how implausible that mission actually was at the time. France's own nobility hadn't managed to turn the war around. Its most experienced commanders hadn't managed to turn the war around. And yet an illiterate teenage girl from a village most people had never heard of believed she'd been personally instructed by heaven to do it. In 1429, she traveled to the castle at Chinon to convince that prince, Charles VII, that her mission was real. Accounts from the period describe Charles testing her by hiding among his own courtiers, trying to see if she could pick him out of the crowd without being told which man he was. She did. He believed her. Within months, she'd helped break the siege of Orléans, a turning point the French had been unable to achieve for years, and stood beside Charles at his coronation in Reims, the traditional coronation site of French kings, which had been firmly under enemy control before her involvement. For a brief window, it looked like the war might actually be ending in France's favor, and it looked like it was ending because of her. A year later, that momentum collapsed. Burgundian forces captured her at the siege of Compiègne and sold her to their English allies, who wanted her discredited as badly as they'd once feared her on the battlefield. This wasn't simply a matter of ransom or prisoner exchange. Discrediting her mattered strategically. If Joan could be exposed as a fraud, or worse, a heretic acting under demonic influence, then everything she'd helped accomplish, the broken siege, the coronation, the momentum shift in the war, could be reframed as illegitimate. Her trial began on January 9, 1431, and ran for 4.5 months. She faced Bishop Pierre Cochon and a court of more than 40 clerics, all operating under English political control, in a region of France under English occupation. The charges were heresy and witchcraft, and the proceedings themselves were built to guarantee a conviction rather than to determine the truth. She was denied legal counsel. She was interrogated repeatedly, sometimes daily, by men trained specifically to trap her in contradictions. She answered most of it herself, without formal education, in ways that even some of her judges reportedly found unsettling. And her conviction also created a political problem for the king himself. If Joan really had been a heretic, then his own coronation, the one she'd helped bring about, had effectively been arranged by the forces of evil. That's part of why, 25 years later, Charles VII personally requested the retrial that eventually cleared her name, not purely out of loyalty to her memory, but because her guilt and his legitimacy were tangled together in a way he could no longer afford to leave unresolved. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, she was led out to the marketplace of Rouen and burned at the stake. She was 19 years old. In 1456, that second trial overturned the first one completely. Pope Callistus III authorized a commission to re-examine the case. More than 114 witnesses were heard. Soldiers who'd fought beside her, clergy who'd interacted with her during captivity, ordinary townspeople who remembered the trial itself. Investigators found the original conviction had been built on procedural fraud from the start, coerced testimony, manipulated records, and a court with no real interest in a fair outcome. The verdict was formally nullified, but by then, the sentence had already been carried out, and it had been carried out with a very specific goal in mind, one that went far beyond simply ending her life. The English hadn't just planned her execution. They'd planned around the possibility that people would try to turn it into a religious cult the moment it was over. This wasn't paranoia. Cults built around martyrs, saints, and executed holy figures were common throughout medieval Europe, and English authorities were well aware of how quickly public sentiment could turn a controversial execution into a pilgrimage site. So they took precautions. Accounts from the time describe the execution stake being built unusually tall, reinforced with plaster, not for spectacle, but specifically to keep the crowd back, so nobody could rush forward during the burning and grab a bone, a lock of hair, a scrap of clothing to carry off as a relic. Executioners burned her body once, then a second time, then a third, until nothing remained but ash. This repeated burning wasn't standard execution procedure. It was a deliberate, extra step taken specifically to prevent exactly the kind of relic cult that would eventually spring up around her memory anyway, 4 centuries later, through an entirely different route. According to later retellings, her heart resisted the flames, and one soldier, shaken by what he'd just done, reportedly said out loud that they had burned a saint. That detail is folklore more than forensic fact, the kind of story that tends to attach itself to executions like hers after the fact, once the political winds have shifted and the executed figure has become a martyr in the popular imagination. What happened next, though, is well documented. Her ashes were gathered up, carried to a bridge over the Seine River, known as the Pont Mathilde, and thrown into the water. English authorities did this on purpose, specifically so that no bone, no lock of hair, no fragment of her body could ever be recovered and turned into a holy relic. It was the final step in a plan that had already involved an unusually tall stake, plaster reinforcement, and triple cremation. As far as the historical record is concerned, Joan of Arc has no grave. She was never supposed to have physical remains at all. That absence isn't a historical accident or an unfortunate loss. It was the entire point. That's what makes the year 1867 so strange. 436 years after her execution, a small glass jar turned up in the attic of a Paris apothecary. Its label read, "Remains found under the stake of Joan of Arc, Virgin of Orleans." Inside were a blackened rib bone roughly 4 inches long, a cat's leg bone, a few fragments of what looked like charcoal, and a scrap of dark linen. There was no explanation attached for how any of this had survived English efforts specifically designed to prevent survival. There was no documented chain of custody stretching back 4 centuries. There was just a label, an attic, and a jar. Nobody seems to have asked how remains supposedly thrown into a river 4 centuries earlier had ended up sitting in a pharmacy attic instead. It's a question that, in hindsight, should have ended the story before it began. It wasn't even the only object of its kind to surface over the years. Rings, fragments of cloth, and other alleged personal items tied to Joan of Arc turned up in private collections across France throughout the 19th century, part of a broader wave of 19th century fascination with relics, medieval history, and national heroines. France in this period was actively rebuilding a national identity around figures like her. None of these other objects, though, were taken as seriously or given as much institutional weight as the bottle found in that apothecary attic. The jar was accepted almost immediately. It was placed under the authority of the Archdiocese of Tours and eventually put on permanent display at the Joan of Arc Museum in the town of Chinon, the very same town where, more than 400 years earlier, a teenage girl had once walked into a castle and convinced a future king that God was on his side. The symmetry of that location almost certainly helped the relic's credibility, whether anyone consciously intended it to or not. Relics like this weren't unusual within Catholic tradition. For centuries, physical fragments connected to saints and martyrs had been treated as spiritually significant objects, worthy of veneration, blessing, and careful protection. Churches across Europe held pieces of bone, scraps of cloth, locks of hair, all catalogued, all trusted, all rarely if ever subjected to scientific testing. The entire system ran on institutional trust, rather than empirical verification. A relic's legitimacy came from who possessed it, who blessed it, and how long it had been accepted, not from any physical examination of what it actually was. In an era before forensic science existed, a documented chain of custody and the approval of a bishop were essentially all the verification a relic needed. Joan of Arc's bottle simply fit into that existing system, at exactly the moment it was needed most, arriving decades before her canonization campaign would begin building serious momentum. In 1909, the exact year the Catholic Church beatified Joan of Arc on her path to sainthood, officials examined the relic and declared it highly probable that it was genuine. By then, the jar had already been part of church tradition for over 40 years. Questioning it on the eve of her beatification would have meant questioning the process itself, and nobody wanted to be the one to say that out loud. The timing here matters enormously. This wasn't a neutral scientific evaluation performed in isolation. It was an examination conducted at the exact moment institutional incentives most favored a positive result. She was canonized a saint 11 years later, in 1920. For most of the 20th century, this jar sat behind glass, as one of the only physical connections anyone had left to her, cited in guidebooks, referenced by clergy, treated as settled history for generation after generation, surviving 2 world wars, the fall of empires, and the birth of modern forensic science itself, before anyone finally turned that science on the jar. But the strangest part of this story was never that a fake relic existed for so long. It was what happened when scientists finally decided to test it properly. Starting in 2006, forensic scientist Dr. Philippe Charlier assembled a team to examine everything inside that jar. Charlier wasn't new to this kind of work. That same year, he'd used forensic testing to prove that Agnès Sorel, mistress of King Charles VII, the same king Joan of Arc had helped crown, had died of mercury poisoning centuries earlier, solving a mystery historians had argued over for generations. Charlier had built a career out of applying modern forensic tools to cases everyone assumed could never be solved. Cold cases that happened to be 500 years old instead of 5. The Joan of Arc relic was exactly the kind of case he specialized in. A question historians had simply stopped asking, not because it had been answered, but because nobody had the tools to answer it until relatively recently. The investigation into the Joan of Arc relics eventually grew to roughly 20 researchers from France, Switzerland, and Benin, including forensic anthropologists, geneticists, a radiologist, biochemists, a pollen specialist, a zoologist, and an archaeologist. 14 of them signed the final published analysis. This wasn't a quick opinion issued for a headline. It was a multi-year, multi-discipline forensic autopsy performed on a 500-year-old crime scene, using every tool a modern lab had available. Each specialist brought a completely different angle to the same handful of fragments. The pollen specialist could identify what plants had been present wherever the material had originated. The zoologist could confirm species identification on the cat bone. The radiologist could examine internal bone structure without physically destroying the samples. They ran DNA analysis on the bone fragments, though DNA testing on burned or centuries-old material is notoriously difficult, since heat and time both degrade genetic material. Part of why the team leaned on several independent methods rather than resting the entire case on any single test. A single ambiguous DNA result wasn't going to settle anything on its own, so the team built their case the way a criminal investigation builds a case. Multiple independent lines of evidence, all pointing toward the same conclusion, so that no single failed test could undermine the whole finding. They ran chemical analysis on the blackish coating covering the bones, looking for the specific chemical fingerprint left behind by whatever process had actually touched them. Fire leaves one signature, embalming leaves a completely different one, and the two are not easily confused once you know what to look for. They used multiple forms of microscopy to examine the material at the cellular level, looking at bone structure in a way that could distinguish cremated bone from bone that had simply decayed or been chemically treated. And they used radiocarbon dating, which works less like a guess and more like a hidden receipt, stamped inside every living thing the moment it dies, recording almost exactly how long ago that happened, whether the label on the jar agrees or not. The results didn't just fail to confirm the relic. They pointed somewhere nobody in that museum had ever considered. The blackish coating on the bones wasn't soot from a fire. Chemically, it matched embalming resin, the kind used in ancient Egyptian mummification. This alone should have been enough to end the debate. Soot and embalming resin are chemically distinct substances, produced by entirely different processes, and a laboratory equipped to test for one can easily rule out the other. Radiocarbon dating placed the material to somewhere between the 6th and 3rd century BC, Egypt's late period, the final stretch of independent Egyptian rule before Persian and then Greek conquest. That's over 2,000 years before Joan of Arc was even born. To put that gap in perspective, the distance between the material in that jar and Joan of Arc's execution is roughly the same as the distance between Joan of Arc's execution and today, doubled. The human rib, recovered from the execution site of a 15th century French martyr, was, according to the evidence, part of an Egyptian mummy older than the Roman Empire itself, a relic that had been kissed, blessed, and prayed over for 140 years, had nothing whatsoever to do with the woman it was named after. To rule out any mistake, the team turned to a technique almost nobody had used on ancient bones before: smell. It sounds almost absurd next to DNA sequencing and radiocarbon labs, but it turned out to be one of the most decisive tests in the entire investigation. 2 professional perfumers, one from the House of Gourland, one from Jean Patou, were given the samples blind, mixed in with 9 unrelated bone and hair samples, without being told what any of them were, and without being allowed to speak to each other. The blind, double-source design mattered here. If only one perfumer had been used, or if the 2 had been allowed to compare notes, the result could easily be dismissed as suggestion or bias. 2 independent professionals, working in isolation, with zero information about what they were smelling, removed that possibility entirely. It sounds like an unlikely forensic method, but embalming compounds and burnt organic material both leave distinct volatile traces that can survive, faintly, for thousands of years, locked inside porous bone. Independently, both noses reported the same 2 notes: burnt plaster and vanilla. Burnt plaster actually matched the history. Joan of Arc was reportedly burned on a stake reinforced with plaster, built unusually tall to keep the crowd back and prolong the execution. On its own, that note might have seemed like confirmation. But vanilla isn't something you smell on a body that's been cremated. Cremation destroys the kind of organic compounds that would produce a vanilla-like scent. It's a note chemically associated with the slow breakdown of embalming compounds over thousands of years, specifically vanillin-related compounds that form as ancient embalming resins degrade, the same compounds used in ancient Egyptian preservation. Two people, working blind, with no idea what was actually in front of them, had just independently confirmed what the chemists and the radiocarbon lab were already finding, using nothing but their sense of smell. DNA, chemistry, radiocarbon dating, and now smell, gathered blind by people who had no idea what they were sniffing. 4 completely different methods, run by 4 different types of specialists, using 4 completely different kinds of equipment, all landed on the exact same conclusion. In forensic science, that kind of convergence is about as close to certainty as this field gets. It's the difference between a single witness and 4 independent witnesses who've never spoken to each other, all describing the same events. Some historians had floated a theory before any of this testing, that the cat bone might have been thrown onto the pyre on purpose, since cats were closely associated with witchcraft and the devil throughout this period of European history, and it wouldn't have been out of character for a 15th century mob to add one to an execution meant to symbolize heresy. It's a good story, and it fits neatly with everything we know about medieval attitudes toward cats, witchcraft, and public executions. It just isn't true. Radiocarbon dating alone rules it out. Nothing in that jar came from 1431. Nothing in it came from Rouen. Both the rib and the cat femur were already more than 2,000 years old before Joan of Arc's trial even began, which means whatever symbolism people assumed was baked into that jar for over a century never actually existed at all. The cat bone wasn't a 15th century addition to a witch burning. It was ancient Egyptian material, possibly from a mummified animal, that had nothing to do with Joan of Arc's execution whatsoever. So who put a 2,000-year-old Egyptian mummy fragment in a jar and labeled it a French saint? The leading theory points to the exact place the jar first surfaced, a 19th century Paris apothecary. At the time, powdered Egyptian mummy was a real, commercially sold medicine, used to treat stomach ailments, prolonged bleeding, and other common complaints. This wasn't a fringe practice. Mummy, as a medicinal ingredient, had circulated through European pharmacies for centuries by that point. A strange historical footnote most people today have never heard of. Apothecaries kept it in stock the way a modern pharmacy keeps aspirin, imported in bulk from Egypt and sold by the spoonful, often ground from mummified remains that had already been stripped of any individual identity centuries earlier. In other words, the raw material for this exact kind of forgery wasn't rare, exotic, or hard to obtain. It was sitting on a shelf in the same building where the jar eventually surfaced. Someone with access to that supply, at the exact moment the push to canonize Joan of Arc was gaining real momentum across France, had both the raw material and a plausible motive sitting in the same building. A physical relic, something pilgrims could see and touch, would have been extremely useful to that cause, at a time when her case for sainthood needed exactly that kind of tangible proof. Whether the goal was religious devotion, financial gain, or simple opportunism, someone appears to have manufactured exactly that, decades before she was actually beatified in 1909 and canonized in 1920, using material that was, quite literally, sitting on the shelf. Here's the number worth remembering. This fake relic was accepted by church officials, put on public display, and treated as sacred for 140 years before a forensic team proved it wasn't even the right species, let alone the right person. For context, this relic had already been on public display for nearly 2 decades before the Statue of Liberty was even built. It sat in a museum case longer than most countries have existed in their current form. It outlasted the fall of the French monarchy's remaining vestiges, 2 world wars, and the entire rise of modern science, all while sitting quietly behind glass, unchallenged. Nobody has ever conclusively identified who assembled it, or proven their exact motive. The trial that convicted Joan of Arc, and the trial that later cleared her name, both survive today in extraordinary documentary detail. Hundreds of pages of testimony, still studied by historians nearly 600 years later. Every question, every answer, every procedural detail of both trials was written down, preserved, and eventually published. But the identity of whoever built this one small forgery was never written down anywhere. No confession, no ledger, no apothecary's note explaining what they'd done and why. The forensic team could tell you everything that was inside that jar, and exactly how old it was, down to a window of a few centuries. They couldn't give you a name. That part of the mystery is still open, and at this point, it probably always will be. What this case actually exposes isn't really about Joan of Arc specifically. It's about how easily physical proof gets accepted once enough people already want to believe it. A label, an archbishop's blessing, and 140 years of unquestioned display were enough to turn a fragment of an anonymous ancient Egyptian into one of the most venerated objects in French Catholic history. Nobody checked. For a century and a half, nobody had to. The relic didn't need to survive scrutiny. It only needed to survive without ever facing any. It took a team of 20 scientists, 4 independent methods, and modern radiocarbon technology to do what a single skeptical question could have done in 1867. If anyone had simply asked how remains thrown into a river could have ended up in an apothecary's attic in the first place. Modern forensic science finally did what generations of historians, priests, and pilgrims never thought to do. It didn't just prove a relic was fake. It proved, nearly 600 years later, that the original plan from 1431 actually worked. Joan of Arc's ashes went into the Seine, specifically so that nothing of her would survive to be worshipped. Almost 6 centuries later, the science agrees with the executioners. The debunked bottle still exists today, but now it sits in a museum in Chinon labeled honestly, as a forgery rather than a relic, in the same town where a teenage girl once convinced a king to believe in her. There is no piece of Joan of Arc left anywhere on Earth. There never was.